Our immigration laws go all the way back to 1790, and they were not established for the purposes of law and order. They weren't established for the purposes of preventing people from overusing public benefits. They were they were created for the purposes of racial control. Immigration laws in the United States were established to keep the country white. That wasn't a side effect or a mere reflection of existing racial inequality. That was the actual goal. And just a quick review of those laws. We've heard about some of them tonight already. In 1790, citizenship was first codified into law. Here's a picture of the country in that moment and what the law stated. It was made available to free white men who'd been in the United States for 2 years. Those were the only requirements. After that, in 1882, Congress passed Chinese exclusion into law, and that was followed in 1917 by an immigration act barring all Asians from the United States. So these are Asian women. That's how the United States government described them in this official photograph. They were detained in Angel Island off of San Francisco Bay around 1910. In 1924, the United States got the national origins quota system, and it's right there in the name. We set quotas based on how many people were allowed into the United States at a given time, and those quotas heavily favored white European countries. So you can see the New York Times headline declared the end of the American melting pot, and the quotas were in place for more than 40 years until 1965. Even as the country grew, some limits were placed on white immigration, but they weren't meaningfully enforced, and they were often coupled with programs that were designed to help white European undocumented immigrants legalize themselves. So, for example, in 1929, Congress created or passed the Registry Act, which allowed people who could prove that they'd been in the United States for 8 years or more to pay just $20 and gain legal status. But 80% of the immigrants in the United States at the time were white Europeans. And from 1935 until 1939, the Immigration and Naturalization Service used a program called pre-examination to allow undocumented immigrants to enter the United States and then just to exit the United States and then magically re-enter as legal immigrants. But they only allowed this to happen at the northern border. So while race wasn't written into the name or the description of the program, in its actuality, it only allowed white immigrants to legalize, and all of the non-white, mostly Mexican undocumented immigrants in the United States lived in the South and didn't have access to this quick form of legalization. There are also lots of examples if you go back and see members of Congress and judges intervening personally in cases of white European immigrants, some of whom had committed no crime other than entering the United States without permission, others who had criminal records, sometimes serious ones. But our elected officials, judges, people in power felt that deporting those people was too severe a punishment for the crime they were accused of. And so they were on an individual basis let off the hook and allowed to legalize. So these formal programs really changed the trajectories of many European immigrant families' lives for generations and allowed them to flourish. And here's a photo and an example of them flourishing. Meanwhile, non-white undocumented immigrants were facing intense immigration enforcement and harassment. The Eisenhower administration, I'm just going to give you a few examples. You heard about a couple more in the introduction, and we could really go on ad nauseum with examples. But in the 1950s, the US government launched an effort to deport millions of Mexican immigrants specifically. INS officers stormed immigrant communities from California to Illinois, and the historian May Nye found a congressional report that compared the cargo ships that some immigrants were loaded onto during these deportations to ships that were carrying people who were enslaved through the Middle Passage. She documented a raid in 112-degree heat where 88 people died and found the remarks of a labor leader at the time who said that people were being herded like cattle into the backs of trucks to be sent back to Mexico. The goal of this program, as stated, was only to deport people of Mexican origin who didn't have legal status in the United States. But government officials later acknowledged that hundreds of thousands of Mexican American United States citizens and legal residents were also deported. During this time, and this is a picture of some of those deportations being carried out under the Eisenhower administration. During this time, Mexican American citizens and legal residents also suffered regular indignities at the hands of border enforcement authorities. From 1917 into the 30s, a program required people crossing the border legally from Mexico only to be bathed on their way into the United States. And people would dress up ahead of crossing the border because anyone who was determined to look as if they were dirty by Border Patrol officers would be bathed in a special mixture of chemicals that included kerosene. Their belongings were put into gas chambers to be sanitized. From the 1930s into the 60s, border agents sprayed DDT, which is considered a probable carcinogen, onto the faces of more than 3 million guest workers from Mexico, despite there being no scientific basis that any of this was necessary. The disparities in deportations continued. By the 1980s, when Mexicans made up just over half of the undocumented population, they accounted for 9 of 10 immigration arrests. And today, 98% of people who are deported from the United States are not white. So when we examine our immigration system, we actually find that we have two. One, where white European immigrants are welcomed into the United States, their sins forgiven, exceptions made to help them enjoy the full benefits of legal status. Quoting Hannah Arendt, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren has stated twice in opinions that citizenship is man's basic right, for it's nothing less than the right to have rights. And then we have a second immigration system where non-white immigrants and even non-white citizens have been harassed and deported, where those rights have been dangled before them occasionally and then stolen. Somehow, all of this seems to have been lost to history. Americans don't know about pre-examination, and they don't know about the deportation of Mexican American citizens, which is why so many Americans believe wrongly today that their families came to the United States the right way, and that if people hoping to resettle in the United States would only just follow the rules, they would be welcomed. This early period of pre-examination and registry is also when eugenic stereotypes were first established and applied to immigrants in our cultural mainstream. The main ones are that immigrants are predisposed inherently to crime, poverty, and disease. A lot of these stereotypes were initially applied to people who we now think of as white. They weren't at the time, but it's the same arguments that have just been shifted onto a new population of people. And the fact that we still hear these same arguments so frequently says to me that a lot of Americans just aren't armed with the knowledge to be able to spot this recycling of fear-mongering almost verbatim out of our history books. So I'm going to show you a few newspaper clippings from the United States and the UK depicting immigrants to the United States. This first one is an illustration of Chinese exclusion that ran in Harper's, and it calls Chinese people dishonest, immoral, heathenish, barbarians, the lowest and vilest of the human race. Here's one illustrating Irish immigrants in the United States, calling them the most recently discovered wild beast and an American advocate of indiscriminate murder. And another illustrating Italian immigrants that ran in the Mascot, a New Orleans newspaper in 1889. It describes Italians as a nuisance to pedestrians, shows a picture of them begging on the street. It shows them living in filthy, overcrowded housing conditions. And it also says it shows an afternoon's pleasant diversions for Italian immigrants, which is depicted with a picture of them attacking people with knives in the streets. So all of these lines sound very familiar, right? These are all things that you've heard said almost again verbatim about today's immigrants. And I think if you start to look out for these three ideas that immigrants are predisposed toward crime, poverty, and disease, you'll start to notice them even more after tonight. And now that we've had the opportunity to see that many of our own ancestors were described in those exact same terms, I hope we'll be armed with the knowledge to immediately be able to call them out as cynical and untrue. These stories pop up again and again in American politics because they're effective. Since this country's founding, politicians facing voters who are dissatisfied with their prospects in life, their economic prospects, their educational prospects, what have you, they figured out they can do something a lot easier than actually addressing voters' real concerns. Instead, what they can do is stoke those concerns even more, get people really riled up and mad, and then blame immigrants. Even politicians who don't engage in that kind of fear mongering know how powerful it is. And that is sort of even more key. That's harder to spot. But that's why you don't see them standing up with the truth in the face of these arguments that we know don't stand up to facts. Instead, they cower in the face of those arguments because they understand the power that they carry. So the truth is that, yes, we do need a functioning immigration system, but instead of the disorderly chaos that has become the norm. But people without legal status currently make up a majority of agricultural workers, close to half of construction workers, a third of hospitality workers, about a fifth of healthcare workers. I believe all of those estimates, by the way, are undercounts because of how those surveys are taken. But even if we take the numbers we have as true, our reliance on this population is undeniable. It's also true statistically, and I'm kind of almost tired of saying and writing it at this point because I've done it so many times. But of course, statistically, immigrants are less likely to commit crime than people born in the United States. And they're also far less likely to rely on public benefits. In fact, they're not eligible for the vast majority of public benefits. On top of that, immigrants without legal status live in all 50 American states. And I think that's something that the moment of enforcement we're living through now is starting to drive home. I think before, people really thought of immigration as this issue that was, those other people over there. And now almost every American community is having to face the fact that they too are impacted by this issue, whether they like it or not.